Good morning, Central Kentucky. This is Sandra, Leslie White, coming to you live from WJMM Studios here in Versailles, Kentucky. And I cannot get my chair to work. Okay, I'm going to press on. So good morning out there. All of you around the country, WJMM.com, Facebook Live this morning. And I want to especially shout out to David out there in Jacksonville, Florida. How are y'all doing out there in Florida coastline? Looks like the longest, biggest, scariest, weirdest storm Dorian ever. But anyway, I hope you're doing well this morning and able to listen in. He and I have had some interesting conversations about just the real move of God, today for us women to be women, men to be men. So, David, I think this show will interest, they will understand the message and the meaning behind being sown for good. That's the title of the message today. Sown for Good. Did you know that I even tried to type in the title on my phone for Facebook and I couldn't type in S-O-W-N. It just kept popping up D-O-W-N, S-O-W-N. It is a word, sown for good, but there's also an S-E-W-N. I guess you can guess the difference. To be sown into the land. God sows his people into the land. But there's also sewing, which is, like sewing. I've never known how to sew. I can't even sew. I think maybe I could sew a button on if I had to. But there's S-E-W about, the actual needle and thread, the sewing, and, the manufacture of clothing. So anyway, point is, I was doing a little research like I do every morning for you so that we can create something relevant here on Lifting the Veil for the culture. Words of Hosea, penned in the latter part of the 8th century BC, were meant for a time when the land, as we know in Hosea 1:2, the land was committing flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. So Hosea had to marry a wife of harlotry, and this is this great metaphor for how God's people can be adversely affected by the culture. So when I was looking for just sown for good, I'm looking for some understanding. There's an organization called Sown For Good, S-E-W-N. This is the Ardmore bridal designer that is making under her label Sown For Good. Her name is Janice Martin. She's turning placards from political rallies into wearable pieces of protest art. So she settled on something more easily replicated, a silk scarf. Okay, so she's got a line of silk scarves and goes on to say, since she said this, and I quote, the category with the most images had to do with women's health, and the news at the time was all about defunding Planned Parenthood, she said. That was my big button issue. Okay. So the result of this is she created a scarf, and I cannot tell you the title on the air. You're going to have to look it up. Okay, I can't say it on Christian radio. But it's a something power scarf, edged in pink and emblazoned with dozens of placards saying things like, my body, my choice. The first female president is probably in this crowd, quote, and eradicate the hate, quote. There's even a take on the Christopher Gadsden-inspired Don't Tread on Me flag, only with a snake in the shape of a uterus. Okay, can we just move on here? All right, so with one of these scarves around her neck, she attended the 2018 Women's March in Philadelphia, where she gathered additional placards and asked people if they'd like to be a part of her project. Almost everybody said yes, said Martin. The scarves are now made under the Sown For Good label. And Martin founded it several years ago, launching a number of campaigns, including one that benefited Covenant House. For some of her scarves, Martin uses silk sourced from Cambodia via the Tabitha Foundation, which benefits women and children. Okay, so this organization is called Sown For Good. Is that what we are to be is sown, S-E-W-N, for good, or are we to be sown, S-O-W-N, for good into the land? And how can we do that? And how can we differentiate what is good? Okay? And just start talking about this today as openly as I possibly can on Christian radio. So in Hosea 2:23, we're in this verse this week. Yahweh says this, and I'm reading from the New American Standard Version this morning on Lifting the Veil. This is Sandra Leslie White. If you're just tuning in, we're in Hosea 2:23 talking about being sown for good. Yahweh says this, and I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those people who were not my people, you are my people. And they will say, thou art my God. Okay, so we know, if you've been following me, that we are going through this process in Hosea chapter 2, 14 to 23. I write about this extensively in my book coming up called My God, My Man. And that'll be out this fall sometime. And so, certainly before Christmas. Would you all please pray that this is out before Christmas? Process of God, who's about to divorce Gomer in the first half of chapter 2 because of her flagrant harlotry. She was a temple prostitute, supposedly, scholars say. Married to a holy prophet named Hosea, and she's had a couple of children, and now she's going back to her ways, and yet he just decides, I've had enough of her, I'm going to divorce her. That is the first half of chapter 2. Then we go into the second half of chapter 2, and something magnificent happens, I think, between verses 13 and 14. I think that's where he lays it into the picture, anonymously in Hosea. But God has this dramatic change, begins to woo her, and begins to take her through this process where he woos her, he romances her, and then he restores her by taking away all the false gods. He then renews her by betrothing her unto himself, marrying her, and just displaying all these gorgeous bridal gifts in 19 and 20 for ye today that maybe just be, jumping into the show. He betroths her, he says to him, in righteousness and justice, loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness in verse 20, and then you will know the Lord. So it seems to me that this process is going on, this process of, oh my gosh, once we were just, lost, and then he pursues us, we're found, and then he takes us through this amazing process. I think John Calvin called it irresistible grace. But the point of the matter is that he takes us as we go along with the Lord, as we agree with God, as we get into his word, understand what it says, and begin to agree with the word of God, then we begin to experience this amazing adventure of freedom. We go from slavery to freedom. And so I think when we talk about being sown for good, when he says in verse 23, I will sow her for, it's a clear distinction between what I see anyway. And you can call me, you can argue with me, you can send me a nice letter or a nasty letter at Lifting the Veil with Sandra at Gmail. But what I see as the distinguishing factor in being sown for good, S-O-W-N, for good, and sown, S-E-W-N, for good, is the difference between who are we being sown for. So I mentioned, if you're just tuning in, an organization called Sown, S-E-W-N, for good, which is a women's rights organization. It's a very radical, extremely liberal organization talking about women's rights, and I wonder about that. They do support Planned Parenthood. It's one of their benefactors, yes. So I think that the fact of the matter is that they are being sown into the land for what they consider good. But when we are sown into the land, it says in Hosea 2:23. Yahweh will sow her, meaning Gomer, meaning the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel in the day of 826 or so BC, and then takes us on into God's people all the way through the centuries and generations to us today. So that her is representative, I believe, of the church. And I will sow her for myself, capital M, so Yahweh will sow her, the church, for myself, for Yahweh in the land. So distinguish us, okay, from what is good, from being sown into the land, is that he's doing it first and foremost. I mean, this is an act and a move of God in your life and in mine. And I believe that there will come a time in your lifetime, in your great adventure with Jesus, that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit working together, as I see them working together in Hosea chapter 2, I do believe that there'll come a time when you realize that perhaps there's a call on your life to do something more than what you're doing. And you may be a great mother, father, sister, brother, wife, you may be a great employee, you may have a wonderful business, but maybe there comes a time when the Lord has just got you at this place where he's got Gomer, where he has betrothed her unto himself. He's taken her through the dark times and the deep valleys of removing false gods from her. Remember, we talked about that in verse 17, Hosea chapter 2. But she's gone through all of this. We've gone through all of this, and now that you feel good, you're betrothed to God. You feel like you're right with him. Maybe you're in his sweet spot, and it's time, to be planted in the land. It's time, as he says, to be sown in the land for good, for God. For we know Jesus said this. When the rich young ruler came up and said, good teacher, and Jesus challenges him, said, why do you call me good? There's nothing. If we're being sown into the land by God for good, then we've got to line our objectives up, our strategies up, our motives up into what is good and who is God. And the only way we can figure that one out is by knowing his word. Knowing his word, knowing his ways, and knowing that that's countercultural, and certainly would be countercultural, sown for good. Although I know there are good things in there. I know there are great women in there. But the fact of the matter is, if we're doing that on our own initiative and doing that for what we believe in, it's very subjective. But if we go about it with the attitude of, God, what is good? How can I be sown for good in the land? Then we're going to line up with the powerful love of God that delivers people from their deception and from their false gods and from their illusions of doing good. Raising from being a whole new generation up, not just the millennials, and my children are in that, but us too, us oldies, that are really about being sown into the land for good. I look forward to continuing with you. God bless you today.